Well, good morning again. My name is Matt Koomen. I'm excited to be here with you guys today. Like Kurt said, there's a calendar in those black boxes in there. And today we've got some fun beverages in the back. And sometimes people see that as, ooh, there's adult beverages. That is not, we're not allowed here in church to do that. So we've got some fun coffee and some hot chocolate in the back. We'd love to hang out with you and get to know everyone a little bit better after the service. Also, we've got a movie night that's going to be happening in December, so we're really excited for that as well. So I know last week Pastor Trent was in here, and he alluded to the fact that I was at a Green Bay Lions game, so I'm a diehard Detroit Lions fan, and wanted to let you know I came back unscathed. I was not beaten up there. He said one of my love language is sarcasm, which is very much true, and it's dangerous to have the love of sarcasm in an enemy territory like that. But it was great. We had a blast, but we're excited to be back this week. Want to give you one quick announcement. As we get towards the end of the year as a church whole of community, we want to let you know where we are budget-wise, because as you know, it takes finances to keep the lights on, to open the doors, all of those things, and we want to make you aware of where we're at in line. Over the next 2 months, as we get closer to the end of the year, to meet expenses, we need to bring in $834,000. And that number seems huge, and it is huge. That is a big number. But as a church, those big numbers have never been anything we couldn't get to. So I want to challenge you guys as you pray and as you look forward to the next few months to think about what it would mean for you as a family, you as a single person, to think about what generosity looks like, and where your household is at, and how you can step alongside us to meet some of those numbers. So over the next few weeks, we will continue to give you updated numbers on where we're at, so you can continue to be praying for that as well. But I want to encourage you and thank you for living a generous life like you always have. With that said, we're going to jump right into the teaching today. We celebrated Halloween a few weeks ago. Anyone go out trick-or-treating? Yeah, a few of you. It's just fantastic. Us and the girls went out, me and the three girls and my wife went out. Here's a picture of what the girls dressed up as. They were the Beanie Babies. So most Beanie Babies don't have value anymore, but these ones certainly do, right? So cute. We had such a good time. I don't know what the pink Beanie Baby is, but it was warm for our youngest, so that's what worked for us. So we had a blast out trick-or-treating. We went downtown Zeeland and went door to door. But Kenna did a great job. She's our oldest. Like, you just take one piece of candy, right? And she did really good at that. Macy heard that as whatever I can fit in one handful is what gets to go in my bag. So we're still trying to teach that, but we're getting there on that. But what I found interesting is this concept of trick-or-treating as we're going out doing it, right? My kids, even though they're young, realized after a short amount of time that when you go up to the door and when you knock on it, someone is going to open the door with a bowl of candy, and you're going to get a piece of candy right after you say trick or treat. And after that continued for a few houses, they got very active in it. Like, before, we had to kind of walk with them to the door, but after a while they realized there were good things on the other sides of those doors after they knocked. And by the end of, I think we did it for like a half hour. That was enough for the girls. We got home and the girls just unloaded all their candy on the floor. And as a dad, I'm already monitoring it about the ones I'm going to take for the dad tax after they go to bed, right? Like, ooh, that one is for sure going in my mouth. But they go to bed, and after they go to bed, this is just a side thing, not important at all, but we put up our Christmas tree, Halloween night. Anyone else? Don't look at me like that. Don't you give me pity. No, this is good. This is about Jesus' birthday coming up. How dare you guys not put up your trees after Halloween? Thanksgiving is important, but we can celebrate Thanksgiving with a Christmas tree. That's okay. But Why did my kids get so used to trick-or-treating? Why did they feel comfortable with it? Because they understood and they got used to when they went to a door, when they knocked on those doors, they would be open to them and they would have candy on the other side of those. And once they got used to that, they really enjoyed that and they wanted more of that. They wanted to go up to doors and knock on them and for those doors to be open, greeted with piles full of candy. And what's interesting is Jesus has some very similar language from the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to be in Matthew 7 to 12 this morning. And you'll notice some very similar language. Verse 7, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds. And to one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you, then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. These are words from the Sermon on the Mount. And if you haven't been with us over the last probably month or two since the end of summer, we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount slowly and looking at these words of Jesus as he takes what's happening in culture or the world back in that day and saying, hey, you've heard it said this way, and I'm teaching you something new. This is the old law. I'm bringing something new about what is happening. There's a better way to live. And we like these verses, don't we? When we read these things, ask and you will receive, knock and the door will be open to you. We like reading those verses and we want them to be true. My girls lately also, when they go to either side of their grandparents, they want to go and knock on the door. Right? They want to go knock on the door because they know that grandpa and grandma are going to answer that door, right? And they know after grandpa and grandma open the door, there's going to be toys behind there. There's going to be food. They are going to be loved and spoiled beyond belief more than we probably want them to be. But that's how it's supposed to happen, right? Like as grandparents, they want their grandchildren to knock on the door and for them to be greeted well. And as my kids, they know there's safety on the other side of that. Right? Tell me if I'm off base, but many of us, I would argue, live our spiritual lives with that same childlike nature, that childlike understanding that when we knock, the door will be open. When we ask for something, we will be given something, especially after we read these words from Jesus. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Right? We read those words and we think, okay, what does Jesus mean by that? Because all of us in some way, whether it's happened personally to us or maybe a friend or a coworker, knows that sometimes that door doesn't seem to open. Right? What we are asking for may not be answered in the way that we want. What happens when you ask for something and you don't actually receive it? Maybe you've been praying for a good friend who's gotten a diagnosis and the results aren't like you've been praying for. Now, what does that mean? You asked, but you didn't receive what you wanted. Maybe your marriage is falling apart and you've been praying hard and there doesn't seem to be an answer. There doesn't seem to be a door opening that you want it to. Maybe every week you're trying to make ends meet financially and you pray for an extra source of income or something to happen, and yet nothing is coming up. You see, I think back to this idea of trick-or-treating. How long would my kids have lasted had they gone up to a door and they knocked on it and knocked on it and knocked on it and it does not open? Would they continue standing there? Right? And I think for us as Christians, when we hear verses like this and we get this understanding of, okay, Jesus says he's going to open the door. Jesus says he's going to give me something. But how long will we stand there knocking? How long will we continue to ask when we don't feel like there's a response, when we don't feel like God is doing something? I want to share another story with you that comes in the Bible, still in the New Testament, about a year after Jesus gives these words of the Sermon on the Mount. We're reading the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew, and we're going to jump to a different disciple perspective, the Gospel of John. Matthew and John are both disciples of Jesus, but giving accounts to Jesus on different ways. So we're going to look at a story coming out of John 11, and it's the story of Lazarus. Some of you may be familiar with this story. Starts out like this. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who had poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one that you love is sick." Now I want a quick stop here because there's a few interesting things that are happening already in these first few verses. We see, if you're aware, you've got friends. Let's start here. You've got friends, and then you've got acquaintances. Maybe they're coworkers. You're not quite friends, but I have to see you a lot, so I know a lot about you, maybe. And then you've got your Facebook friends that you don't ever see. They come up on your feed occasionally when they go on vacations, and you're like, "Wow, you're living such a pretty life," right? All of those things, right? For Lazarus and Jesus, I would argue that Lazarus and Jesus were friends, and Mary and Martha, they were friends. They knew each other well, and they called each other friends. The reason that we know this is that Mary and Martha end those few verses was sending a messenger to Jesus saying, "The one whom you love is sick." So Jesus isn't even told it's Lazarus, but we'll find that Jesus knows immediately who it is. So we find that Lazarus and Jesus and Mary and Martha are all good friends together. But Lazarus is sick. And I think it's worth noting here too, and this really isn't going to be part of the message today, but it is worth noting that bad stuff was still happening to Lazarus. Bad stuff was still happening to Jesus' friends, right? It's interesting to realize that, okay, these people were very close to Jesus, and yet still some things were happening in their lives that they didn't want to happen. The one whom you love is sick. Now, this isn't just sending a messenger to go on Facebook and tag Jesus and say, "Hey, we need you to come this way." Right? It's not just simply sending mail because Jesus is out doing ministry at this point. Remember, previously he had been on the Sermon on the Mount. He's slowly moving around Galilee, speaking to people, healing people, doing wondrous works of God. And he's not staying in one spot. Now, we know from a few previous stories of where Jesus probably was located at that point. And from Mary and Martha, it was probably about 20 miles that this messenger had to go find Jesus, right? He was probably doing ministry in Galilee somewhere. So that messenger had to be like, "Okay, so you've got this message for me to give to Jesus, and I just have to go look for him." Right? I have to go find him somewhere. So what we see from this, and I think the importance of this, is that how much value Mary and Martha already had on Jesus. They knew what Jesus could offer. And so they knew it was worth and valuable to send a messenger to try and find Jesus in time. This continues here in verse 4. When he heard this, being Jesus, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. See, that's an interesting thing to note there, right? In verse 4, we see, although Jesus loved Lazarus, although he loved Mary and Martha, he stayed where he was for another 2 days. Right? If you've got friends who call for you who are sick and there's something going on, right? There's an immediacy that you run to them, right? Yet Jesus responds in a very different way than Mary and Martha were asking him to. They were asking him to do something specific. Come here quickly because Lazarus is sick. And yet Jesus, he understands the urgency in it, and yet he responds very differently. I'm not sure if you're anything like me, but when I have a prayer request, when I've got something going on in my life that I'm asking of Jesus, something big, when I'm asking God for something, I very specifically ask how I want Jesus to respond to it. Right? Anyone else in that nature where it's like you've got a problem and you're like, Jesus, I've already thought this through about the best outcome. So this is how I'd like you to answer in my problem today, right? Like this is how I'd like you to respond. This is when I would like you to respond. And this is who I'd like you to respond with, right? We have this idea in our heads of how Jesus is supposed to do this. And I'd argue that that's not necessarily how it goes for us all the time, is it? Jumping ahead a little bit into verse 17 of John. On this arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. So Lazarus has since passed away, and the burial process has already happened. He has been in the tomb for 4 days at this point. And I think it's worth noting here that John, who's writing this gospel, notes 4 days. And there's a little bit of Jewish history behind that. Jewish tradition believe that so this is Jewish tradition. So the people probably following the Old Testament, their traditions and their beliefs and understandings told them that a person's spirit would hang around the body for 3 days. Now, I don't know exactly where they got that. If you think, okay, maybe some people were in comas and would come back after a certain amount of time, that's how they got some of those 3-day notions. But what they realized, if the body did not come back to life after 3 days, the spirit actually left the body. There was no coming back from that. And that, I would argue, is why John writes in this gospel that it's now been 4 days. All right, this tells people that Lazarus is beyond all hope. Not only has his spirit most likely left the body from this Jewish tradition, but it's been 4 days, right? The body is going to start decaying. The body is going to start smelling. It is completely beyond all hope. And I think when the Bible mentions this 4 days, it gives people who are listening to this the understanding that this person is completely deader than dead, right? There's nothing there anymore. There's no hope and there's no life. Nothing man can do can revive this body after 4 days. Let's continue, verse 20. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. Lord, Martha said, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And what's interesting about the Bible is we don't, in texting nowadays, does anyone use you try to get your tone across by using LOL or haha or emojis? Anyone else? And then you're typically married to someone who doesn't use any of those things, and then they respond and you're like, are they mad at me? Right? Like I'll sometimes text my mother-in-law, like, hey, would you mind watching the kids on Thursday? And she'll respond, sure. And then I'll read that like, are you mad at me? Like, did I do something wrong? Do you not want to see my kids? Do we have an issue here? Like, what does sure mean? I've figured out at this point in marriage, at this time in my life, that fine is not a good response, right? I've figured that out. Fine is not that something is obviously not fine if someone uses fine, but sure, I'm confused about it. It could mean a lot of different things. Sure could be, sure, I'm excited to. Or sure could be, sure, I've got nothing better to do. Why not have your children over here? Like, it could be all sorts on the spectrum, very different things. What sure means. Sure can be anything. And when we think about the Bible, sometimes we don't necessarily get the tone of what is coming across. So when Martha says, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Like, you wonder, what tone is that? Is she angry? Is she sad? Is she disappointed in what Jesus has done? We don't fully know. But what we do know is her response after this lends to the type of faith that Martha had. And I want to read that here for us. In verse 22. But I know, so this is Martha speaking, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. We see some incredible faith here. We see Martha understanding who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God, that he has the power to do everything he wants to. But Lazarus is dead, right? And she says here that, yes, I know that my brother will rise again at the final resurrection. So she's referencing, yes, Jesus, I get it. He'll rise again. We'll see him again someday in heaven. But my brother's dead now. Verse 25, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you're the Messiah, the Son of God who's come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher's here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. Verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. If you had been here. Verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved by the Spirit. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind men have kept this man from dying? So they're referencing, they know the power of Jesus. People are starting to understand the power that Jesus has. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Right? Again, we see this notion to 4 days, the significance of how long he's been in there. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you will always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you are the one that sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. If we think back to how this story started, we see Mary and Martha, they really got a few things right. If we look back to the story as a whole, they knew who Jesus was. They were friends with Jesus, and they believed that Jesus had the power to change things. Right? And they believed that he had miraculous power that no one else did. They knew the value of sending for Jesus to see if they could get Jesus to come to this moment. But what they asked for did not happen in their timetable, right? They had been mourning. It had been days since Lazarus had died. And you can imagine before Lazarus had risen from the dead, the despair that they had and the disappointment that they had because Jesus had not answered, right? Even though they knew he could and they knew he had the power to answer, Jesus was nowhere in sight in their eyes, right? I want to name something here. It wasn't the closeness of Mary and Martha to Jesus that got their prayers answered quicker, right? That got Jesus there quicker. That is not how this works here. I want to read these words from Jesus again. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For anyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Like my children on a Halloween, we have it all mapped out in our heads how those doors are going to be opened, right? For my kids, they know when they knock on the door shortly in just a few seconds because the other person's ready on the other side of the door is going to be opened and they'll be met with a warm home that's got candy in it and they're going to be able to choose candy and then they're going to move on to the next thing. And I think for us, when we knock on that door, do we have a different understanding? Right after we read these stories, after we read this Sermon on the Mount excerpt, do we expect that very same thing on our timeline, on our agenda? What if what we get from Jesus, what if what we get is actually different than what we expect? Is Jesus still answering us? A few questions I have for you. What if when we knock, we actually see Jesus answer? What if when we seek, we actually find Jesus? We may not be finding what we're looking for, but maybe what if we find Jesus in those moments? What if when we ask, we receive Jesus? Right? Jesus may not be originally what we're asking for, but what if the whole point of this Sermon on the Mount part that says, ask and you will receive, what if Jesus is saying, regardless of what situation you may be dealing, if you ask, I am. Right? I am what you will get. I am enough. This may be difficult to understand, but I truly believe that if we ask, if we knock, if we seek, we will find Jesus. So maybe if we think back to, maybe it's a diagnosis, right? If you know somebody who's been diagnosed with something and we pray for it all to go away, we pray for good results, and we ask, maybe sometimes what we actually receive is Jesus. And when we ask, we realize that we actually can't do this on our own, that we're not in control of things. And maybe when we realize that we can't do this on our own, we realize that somebody else is in control at the end of the day. Right? That God is in full control of things. And what if, when we realize that God is in control of things, that we get a sense of peace that can only come from somebody who's got the whole world in his hands? And what if, when we realize that we serve a God who's got the whole world in his hands, what does that make that situation with a diagnosis, with a marriage, with finances? Doesn't that all of a sudden compare little to what we know God to be and who we knew God to be and what we know God can do and His glorification through all things? There's a beautiful song I listened to this week, and the first few lines are really beautiful. I love it. The more I seek you, the more I find you. Anyone know that one? Right? The more I find you, the more I love you. I'm not going to be joining the band, so just beware of that. Right? Those lyrics, the more I seek you, the more I find you. The more I find you, the more I love you. A few weeks ago, Jesus, when we were looking at a different part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught the people to pray, right? And in that prayer, Jesus said the words, "Let your kingdom come, let your will be done," and those being God's kingdom, those being God's will being done. See, when we ask, when we seek, when we knock, I would argue that a lot of times what we're asking for, what we're seeking for, and what we're knocking for is actually our kingdom to come. We've got an agenda. We've got things that we have in mind. And when we're doing those things, we're not actually allowing God's kingdom to come. So what if when Jesus is explaining that when you ask, you'll find me? Or when you seek, I will give you me. When you knock, I will always answer the door. It may not be with your agenda or with your timeline or your picture of what you want it to look like, but I promise you that I will be on the other side of that door. If you seek me, you will find me. But I do believe very much so that when we seek Jesus, the more our requests, the more the things we are asking for, the more they shift into what is His kingdom. Right? If we look at the difference between our kingdom and God's kingdom, I truly believe that the more we seek Jesus, the more that our desires become His desires. Not the other way around. God's desires do not become our desires. Our desires become God's desires. What is on our heart as we continue to seek Jesus becomes what is on God's heart. our posture starts changing, the things we ask for starts changing, the things that we seek start changing. Ask and you will receive. See, it may not be exactly what we anticipate, but it could be the very thing that brings God glory. As we end today, if there is one truth I hope you grab onto today, it's this. And it's the truth that Jesus will answer the door. He is there. Sometimes it may feel like we're knocking on a brick wall, that there is no hope of it opening. But I assure you that Jesus will open the door. If you seek him, you will find him. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you for today, and I thank you for your word and the way you've spoken. And God, I know sometimes it's hard to understand why things are happening in our lives. And God, I know sometimes it feels like our prayers hit empty ears. But God, I ask that you help us see that you are on the other side of that door. And God, I ask that you help us see that you are listening and you do want what is best for us, even if that looks differently for us. God, I ask that you give us comfort in everything that we do. We ask this all in your name we pray. Amen.